My first reaction was confusion. I was looking at the mountain, looking at the photo in my hands, looking back at the mountain. Could this really be the same place?
We were trying to find the right perspective. We were arguing about it. And suddenly we realized that maybe the perspective in the photo just doesn't exist anymore. Here we were in this magical, primordial, ice-covered equatorial place that was disappearing and changing before most of the world ever knew it existed.
I was in Uganda 4 years ago, and I remember on a clear day seeing these big mountains on the horizon, and I asked what they were, and my friend said, "Oh, those are the Rwenzori mountains."
When Neil asked me whether I'd heard about the Rwenzoris, I remember thinking, yeah, actually I have. I spent my childhood in Nairobi, and my dad had climbed the Rwenzoris in the 1980s, and so I remember seeing his photos and hearing about their adventure.
In 1988, I had an opportunity to climb in the Rwenzori Mountains with a climbing group. Very few people know about the Rwenzori Mountains. First, they're inland. They're in a more remote area. They're quite hard to get to.
For most of recorded history, the Rwenzoris have been a pretty mysterious place. Ptolemy, the ancient geographer, wrote that the Nile River originated in the so-called Mountains of the Moon in Central Africa. But it was almost 2,000 years before any European actually saw the mountains. And many people doubted that they really existed.
The more we learned about these mountains, the more obvious it became that we had to see this place. Everything about the mountains defied expectations. They're taller than the Alps or the Rockies, but they almost never emerge from the clouds. They're on the equator, but they have glaciers at their summits. And most of the plants and animals that you find there can't be found anywhere else in the world. As biologists, as photographers, we just had to see this place.
And then we learned something that made us say, okay, let's stop talking about this. Let's make this happen.
Tropical glaciers are rare. There just aren't too many mountains near the equator that are tall enough to sustain permanent ice.
As we were reading about the Rwenzoris, there were a few phrases that kept coming up. Global warming, climate change, glacial retreat. The glaciers of the Rwenzoris were already 80% smaller than they were a century ago, and some scientists were estimating that they would be completely gone in less than 20 years.
There became this sort of urgency to our plan. If we were going to see this place, we had to go soon. And we had the opportunity to share this place with other people before the glaciers were gone. But how do you show people what glacial retreat looks like?
In 1906, the Duke of Abruzzi, a guy named Luigi di Savoia, led the first expedition to summit the Rwenzori Mountains, and his trip would become one of the most famous mountaineering expeditions of the early 20th century.
The Duke of Abruzzi was a true explorer. He really wanted to show the world places that they'd never seen before, and so on this expedition he hired Vittorio Sella, one of the best photographers of his day, to document every aspect of the expedition, including the famous equatorial glaciers.
If we could retrace the steps of this 1906 expedition and recapture Vittorio Sella's glacier images from the same visual perspectives, then we could show people how much this place had changed.
There is a big difference between having an idea like this and actually making it happen. And so we started looking for funding, but weren't having any luck from the traditional sources. And then we ran into something that was a little different. We heard that Dos Equis, the beer company, was launching a grant program called the Stay Thirsty Grant. And they were offering $25,000 to help people achieve their dream, whatever that might be. So we gave it a shot.
Dos Equis picked 3 finalists, but the overall winner came down to an online vote. And the public decided that our idea mattered.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of Dos Equis, the most interesting academy, and most importantly, the most interesting man in the world, we'd like to award the $25,000 Stay Thirsty grant to Nate Dappen and Neil Losin. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Congratulations.
So we won the first ever Stay Thirsty grant.
We're gonna go to Uganda, man.
Yeah.
All right. Neither of us was physically prepared to climb the Rwenzoris. These would be the tallest mountains that we'd ever climbed, and there are only a few times a year that you can visit the mountains with any hopes of good weather. The name Rwenzori literally means rainmaker in the local language. So we had 1 month to train if we wanted to climb these mountains before the start of the real rains.
Before we knew it, we were on our way to Uganda, and we really had two jobs on this expedition: recapturing the historical photos of the glaciers and documenting the expedition for Dos Equis.
With every step of our journey, we could feel ourselves getting closer to the mountains. But even when we could finally see the foothills, the big peaks stayed hidden.
We're starting to see the peaks. Can't quite see Mount Stanley yet. It's a little bit too cloudy and too hazy back there.
The locals call the mountains shy because they rarely show themselves.
With all our climbing gear and cameras, we were going to need porters and guides, and that meant we needed the Bakonjo, because ever since the Duke of Abruzzi, the Bakonjo people have been the gatekeepers of these mountains. Today, every climber is required to have a guide, and every Rwenzori climbing guide is Bakonjo. Our whole team came together for the first time just outside Rwenzori Mountains National Park. We had James Kagambi, or KG, our climbing consultant. Nasson and Joseph were our Bakonjo climbing guides. Augustine was our cook, and we had several porters to help us carry all the expedition's supplies.
All right, we're finally underway, and we're headed toward the Nyabitaba hut.
You start the climb, and it takes you through a 10,000-foot elevation gain as you're getting into the mountain. It's a several-day hike to get in, so it takes you through so many ecosystems that it's really one of the bizarrest hikes I've ever taken.
You wanted this?
Sure.
Oh, pick it.
What is that?
Wild blackberry.
Each day as we climbed further, we moved through new environments. The montane forest zone, the bamboo zone, the heather zone. Things started getting really crazy in the heather zone, where everything's covered in mosses and lichen, kind of like a fairy tale forest. Hey, we're about to get into Nyamaleju, the place of beards, known for its usnya, which is this hanging vegetation which covers everything up there.
After the heather zone came the Afro-alpine bogs, which is really where the environment starts to look like something out of a Dr. Seuss book.
You just look at the vegetation, and it just feels like you're not on this earth. It's so different. The bogs and the mud in the Rwenzoris are notoriously famous. Anyone who's hiked them remembers them vividly.
Oh, jeez.
Is, for me, definitely the muddiest hike I've ever taken. And I've taken a lot of hikes.
This place is famous for its really deep mud, and you kind of have to jump from these tussocks to tussocks. Otherwise, you're going to get muddy. Anyways, it's going to be a muddy day.
Along with that, you have these guides that are phenomenal people who are just the toughest, some of the toughest people on earth.
Vittorio Sella had taken this amazing portrait of the Bakonjo porters who helped them during the 1906 expedition. And we had our doubts about recreating it. It just didn't feel right, and we didn't want to offend anybody. But when our porters saw that image, they got really excited about it, and they wanted to recreate it to make a 2013 version.
These guys are incredibly proud of the role that the Bakonjo have played in the exploration of these mountains.
We spent our nights in huts, which kept us from getting wetter and muddier than we already were. 3 nights into the trip, the clouds were thick, and we still hadn't seen the peaks that we were planning to climb.
The Duke of Abruzzi was in the Rwenzoris for 40 days. Our trek was only 12 days long, so we only had time to summit each peak once. And we weren't just looking for a clear view to photograph, we needed to recreate specific perspectives.
In his account of the 1906 expedition, the Duke of Abruzzi wrote,
"The one point on which all explorers agreed was the abominable weather encountered in the higher region. Rain almost perpetual, mists in the brief intervals between the downpours, rare clearances, and those only about dawn."
So between the Duke's account and our first few days of weather, we were worried.
Our first peak was Vittorio Emanuele, which is the high point on Mount Speke, and it's over 16,000 feet, so it's higher than either of us had climbed before. As we started the climb, we could finally see the peaks of Mount Stanley across the Bajuku Valley. But a few hours into the climb, the clouds came down, the wind started howling, and by the time we reached the summit, we could barely see each other, much less the peaks across the valley. Still, it was the highest either of us had ever climbed, so we called the day a success. We hadn't had any problems with the first climb, but we also didn't have anything to show for it. Next up was Margarita Peak, which is the highest point in the range. And we got an early start from Elena Hut through this just impenetrable fog. And by the time our feet hit the Stanley Glacier and it started to get light, we knew the clouds weren't going to break, but we needed to summit.
We had 2 more days on Mount Stanley, and neither of us wanted to acknowledge the real possibility that the weather might not cooperate. We just hadn't imagined that the weather was going to be so tough.
On our way back to the hut, we saw something that was just amazing and terrifying at the same time.
We've come across these ladders. Now, these ladders were originally put into place so that people could come off the Stanley Glacier and climb down onto the Margarita Glacier. And the very first one was put up there in 2006. They've had to add a ladder to the original ladder every single year since 2006 in order for the ladders to reach the Margarita Glacier. But now, even the last ladder no longer can touch any glacier because there's no longer any glacier here. In fact, the glacier has retreated about 30 feet up from where I'm sitting right now.
The next morning at Elena Hut, the sky was all stars, and we knew this could be our chance. So we geared up quickly and we headed out toward Alexandra Peak, which is the second highest point on Mount Stanley. And it's a place where we knew Sella had taken several photos.
Finally, we had a clear morning, but something was still wrong. We could find some landmarks, but not others, and nothing really seemed to line up. We had the 1906 images in our hands, but no matter where we went on the Stanley Plateau, Neil and I could not agree on the right vantage points to recreate those images.
Eventually, we started to wonder, well, what if we were up there? In 1906, the glacier would have been a lot thicker, and the perspectives would have been different. If Vittorio Sella had set up his tripod on a glacier, maybe tens of meters above where we were standing, then there was no way we could get those perspectives.
There were photos taken from Alexandra Peak, and we thought for sure that's a vantage point that hasn't changed. The weather was still good. If we could just get to that peak, we could get some of these images.
We nearly summited. In the end, we decided that there was some weather rolling in that we didn't think looked all that good.
You know, in 1906 there was a lot of snow. There was bigger glaciers. You know, people could just flow easily, walk on the Stanley Glacier all the way to Alexandra. Today, looking at Alexandra, looking at some of the other peaks, they are just rocks, and the rocks are loose. You know, a lot of rocks coming down. So it is harder to do exactly the same route that somebody did 100 years ago.
There was only one really good shot left, and that was the Edward Peak, which is the high point on Mount Baker. There are a couple of key images that were taken right from that summit. So if we could reach the summit, and if the weather was clear, we still had a shot at recapturing some of Sella's best images.
We got another early start, and the sky was clear. Of course, we'd seen that before. But as we got closer to the summit, the sky continued to look like it was going to cooperate.
When we reached the summit ridge, we couldn't believe what we were seeing. The valley between us and Mount Stanley was filled with clouds, and that was the one photo that we wanted most. The rest of the sky was blue, but once these clouds come in, they usually stick around.
We got to work recreating other photos from the Edward Peak, but we kept an eye on Mount Stanley just in case. And suddenly the clouds were moving out of the valley and there were no new clouds coming to replace them. In the end, we had just enough clear sky to recapture that one photo that we really wanted.
We were in the right place at the right time, and we got lucky. The next day was back to rain and fog, and we had to start our trek home. The last night of our expedition, everyone felt like celebrating, and our Bakonjo friends showed us how it's done in the Rwenzoris.
Those images from Edward Peak really tell the story the best. I mean, we're standing there in the exact same spot as Vittorio Sella. It's the dry season in both photos. And yet, 100 years later, it looks like a completely different mountain range.
The Bakonjo know these mountains are changing. They see it every time they bring climbers into the mountains. And the irony is that they have almost nothing to do with the cause of the change. Uganda isn't an industrialized nation, but they're the ones who are seeing the climate change in their backyards, and it's going to affect their livelihoods.
The national park protects these mountains from loggers, from poachers, but climate change is different. I was taken aback when one of our guides, Joseph, asked us, what can we do? What can we do to restore our glaciers? And we just had nothing to offer him, because nothing the Bakonjo do is going to change what happens to these glaciers. But maybe we can learn from these mountains. Maybe we can change.
A lot of times people think that, oh, you know, I'm only one in billion people, but a long journey starts with one step. If we want to save our world, that journey can start with one person. Do what is right, and maybe your family will follow suit, your clan will follow suit, your tribe will follow suit, and maybe your whole country will follow suit.
It's a strange thing to visit a beautiful place that you know will disappear. My dad came to these mountains and he climbed these peaks, and it is special to me that I could too. And it's sad to think that my children will never see this place the way I did. A magical mountain on the equator covered in ice.
It was an incredible privilege for us to see these glaciers. But when the ice is gone, people will still visit the Rwenzori Mountains. With or without glaciers, these mountains are unlike any place else. They are the mountains of the moon.